Hi everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. So let's discuss the next step on this the DataBricks and Delta Lake interview question. So we try to understand here the architecture of the DataBricks cluster. So let me walk through you the DataBricks architecture in a very simple manner and explain the key components of the control plane, data plane, and how a Spark cluster work within the Databricks. So here I will be providing you the mini scenario. So end of the video, we will be understanding the architecture of the Databricks and what is the difference between the control plane, data plane, and there are the different subtasks, how it will be handled once the executor are the ones we feed the data to the Databricks and how it will work. So there are the lot of example I am going to provide you. So stay tuned. So end of the video you will be like clear understanding on the architecture of this Databricks, how it will work. So let's discuss about the Databricks architecture overview. Databricks is a unified analytics platform that provide an environment to process the big data using Apache Spark. The architecture has the two component control plane, manage the infrastructure, user interface, and configuration. Data plane, run the actual computation task on your data. Control plane, this is where the Databricks manage everything related to the infrastructure and the interface. Just the keep focus on this, the control plane. Control plane never work on the data. It's contain the workspace management, organize the notebook, dashboard, job, cluster configuration, allow user to create and manage the cluster, job scheduling, enable scheduling of the notebook and the workflow, UI, and the REST APIs provide the user interface to interact with the Databricks. Monitoring and logging, keep track on the cluster and activities. Important points, the control plane doesn't handle your actual data, it's more about the managing the environment. So no name itself it suggests or will understand it is just control or it is just manage the infrastructure of the data breaks. So let understand here like the data plane. So the how data plane will work. Data plane, this is where the actual data process happening within your cloud environment. It includes the cluster management, the infrastructure where the Spark run, compute resources. All computation happen in the data plane using the node like driver and the worker. The important points. Your data remain in your environment. If you are using whatever the cloud, it may be the Azure, AWS or the GCP and it is processed in the data plane. So Databricks cluster and the Spark component. A Databricks cluster is a set of virtual machine running Spark used to process your data. Let's break down into the parts. Driver act as a master node that coordinate the Spark application, manage the Spark content, connect to the cluster and allocate the task to the worker node. So that's the driver work. Worker node, these nodes are backbone of the computation. Each worker node has its own executor that run the task. Executor. The executor, like the actual unit that execute your Spark code, executor process the data and perform the computation in parallel. The task, the small unit of the work in the Spark. Each task run on a executor and process part of the data. So you may be like getting confused here, the driver, worker node, executor, and the task. So coming part, so I will be like helping you. So how it will work. If you are here confused, no worries. So we'll be explaining in the more detail how it will work and how it is correlated. to each other. How does it work? Let's say you want to process a large data set using DataBricks. You start a cluster. Control plane, as we discussed, it is set the environment, the cluster management, and the cluster configuration, security, but it doesn't handle the data. In the data plane, the Spark driver is launched to a manage to the job. Driver request to the worker. Driver split your dataset into the chunk and assign this task to a different worker. The worker and the executor process the data. Each worker node has its executor and the run multiple tasks in the parallel. The executor process its assigned task as such a set of the data to perform calculation and report back to the driver. The driver what will do coordinate the results after the task completion. A driver node collect the results, combine them and present final output. So let's take some of the scenario like it may be like to understand easily. Processing the large data set, you upload the data set of 1 billion of the row to your cloud storage. You create a Databricks cluster with one driver and take four worker node. Databricks split the data into 100 tasks. The Databricks assign 25 tasks to the each of the four worker node. The executor in the worker node processes tasks in parallel. Once all the tasks are completed, the results are sent back to the driver, which compile the final output. So it's still, if you have the confusion, I may be like explaining you the some of the more detail, providing the some example also. So in Spark architecture, driver program, cluster management, worker node work together to execute the task. Here, how these components interact. Driver program. The driver program is the entry point of the Spark application. It creates the Spark content, or like the previously we used to call the Spark content. Now we are calling the Spark session in modern Spark version, and define the operation you want to perform your data. So once the driver is set the program, the entry point to the Spark application. So the next what we'll do, like it's break down the operation into the smaller tasks and coordinate their executor. It communicate with each cluster manager to request the resources like the CPU for memory and execution. And it keep track on the task to process and the final results. So that's the driver. So what driver will do? Driver take the input and communicate to the cluster manager. So cluster manager, so first driver will take the input, whatever the he is getting the order from the code whatever we written, so that the driver will take the input and so he will communicate to the cluster manager for the resources we want. These are the CPU or the virtual machine. So cluster management just arrange the CPU, he will not do anything, but again the driver program connect with the every task, means the what are the tasks he wanted to be, he will only monitor. So I will explain you here like the cluster manager. The cluster manager is the responsible for resource management. It's allocate the resources CPU or across the different worker node. There are the different type of the cluster. So the whatever the cluster we are using, the standalone cluster or the AIM or the Merces or the Kubernetes. The cluster management accept the request from the driver program, assign the resources to it, and provide the allocation or the location worker node where the task can be executed. It ensures that the tasks are distributed across the different worker node for parallel execution. Okay, what we understand here, like so whenever we'll get the input, the cluster management. So what we'll do is manage the cluster. So how much the worker node required the computation power. So that's will provide. So worker node. So the real part, like the where the actual data will take place or the working on the data. Each worker node run on the one or more executor. Means each worker node have one or more executor. The executor is the process that perform the task smaller unit of a larger job and chunk of the data. Executor are the responsible for executing the task and returning the results to the driver program. They also store the data in memory disk if cache is required, helping speed up the future task. So, like we'll conclude here. Still, if you have doubts, so I can explain the some part here. So the many time the in the interview that the question will get asked the architecture of the DataBricks, and so the main component is the driver, cluster management, worker node, and the executor. These are the four component will be consist here. So I will be try to explain you the brief more detail on this here. So you may, if you still have some doubt, so you can get clear here. The driver program submit the job to the cluster. So once we written the program, so what driver program will do? Submit job to the cluster management. So cluster management assign the resources. He just assign the resources means the whatever the resources want to the worker node. So again, like the driver program send task to the executor, so executor working under the worker node. So driver program again will active here and he will send the task what they want to do. So worker node or the executor process the task and send back result to the driver program. The summary of the cluster management serve a middleman. So if you understand here, the cluster management, the middleman, driver program and the worker node, it handle the resource allocation. If it will help only for the resource allocation to ensure that the tasks are executed across the available node and distribution manner. So if you understand here, like the detail, so what the relationship between the driver program, cluster management, and the worker node, it maybe get confused, but the confusion raised because it seemed like the driver program is doing two things: submitting the job to the cluster management and sending task to the executor. Here are the key difference between the role. High level overview. Take submission of the cluster management. The driver program is responsible for submitting the entire job to the cluster management. The cluster manager, a role is to manage the resources, CPU and memory by assigning executor to worker node based on the availability of the resource. It does not execute the task itself, but allocate the resources to the executor. The task assign an executor. Once the cluster management has allocated resources to the worker node, driver program is still responsible for coordinating actual execution. The driver program break down the job into smaller tasks and send those tasks to the executor running on the worker node. Executor which run the worker node actual process the data, perform the computation and return results to the driver program. Why? So maybe we'll like understand here, like why does the driver send task to the executor? The driver program is the brain of a operation. Here is why still communicate with the executor after cluster management has allocated the resources. Like separation responsibilities, the cluster management is only responsible for assigning the CPU memory, like, and the worker node is doesn't handle the scheduling or executing logic. The driver program handle the task scheduling and the splitting the job into the task that will be executed by executor. In granular control, the driver program keep track on all the tasks, their distribution and their process. This help with the default tolerances as the driver can schedule failure task if something is go wrong. Efficiency, driver program can intelligently decide how worker should be split and distribute among the executor based on the data locality and availability of the resource. This minimize the movement and maximize the performance. So again, like last. I would like to be explain the same scenario what we discuss here. Driver program submit a job to the cluster management. Cluster management allocate the resources. Executor on the worker node. Driver program divide job into the task smaller work unit. Driver program send the task to the executor on worker node. Executor execute the task and process the data. Result sent back to the driver program. In summary, the cluster management only assign the resources while driver program is responsible for actual executing the task by sending them to the executor. The driver need to do this because the cluster management does not know the specific how the process the job. It's only manage the resources. So thank you. So let's meet in the next video.